Everyone has opinions. Now, some people have strong opinions on absolutely everything. Other people hold their opinions with maybe slightly less conviction. But all people have opinions. There's no one in existence today or ever who doesn't have an opinion on something. Now, this is immediately obvious, I think, when you have a big life decision to make. Everyone seems to have something to say. Whose opinion are you going to listen to? Whose voice are you going to listen to? I mean, you have an opinion, as does your mum, as does your children, as does your best friend, as does your neighbour, as does your cat. Whose voice are you going to listen to? And I think it's a really important question, but it's also not just for big life decisions. It's also a general question for each of us as we choose how to live our lives. As we live our lives, whose voices are we going to pay attention to? Which voices are we maybe going to ignore? What voices will we allow to have an influence over our lives? In many different cultures around the world, the most important voice to listen to is your parents. That's the one. It's the loudest and most important voice to listen to. You see, they know you, they've got years of experience and wisdom, and they want what's best for you. But maybe, for us, parents' voices aren't the voices we listen to most carefully. Maybe we listen most to the voices of those we deem wise, intelligent, and well thought through. Maybe someone like Martin Lewis, the money-saving expert, or maybe a political figure, or a podcaster, or a preacher. Maybe those are the voices you listen to. Or maybe you don't listen to any of those voices. In fact, you don't listen to other people's voices at all, because you don't really trust what others say. My voice is the one to listen to, right? Our culture more and more is telling us, I think, to listen to our own voice, to trust our gut, our own intuition, to listen to what we want, and to listen to our own voice. Now, the thing is, there are many voices that we may pay close attention to. But what if, in listening to all of them, we can no longer hear the most important voice? What if, amongst all of the loud and competing voices, was God's voice? I spend a lot of time, or some time each week, on the streets of Lancaster talking to people about Christian faith. And I meet many people who tell me that they do believe in some sort of higher power, some sort of God out there. But as I talk more to them, it becomes immediately obvious that this belief of theirs really has little to no effect on how they live their lives. See, the higher power, the God they believe is probably out there, well, he's mysterious. He's hidden. He's distant. And he's silent. You see, they think that God's voice is absent, that God is silent. They look at the world, they recognize the skillful work of the creator, of a creator, but they believe that this creator just made the world and then left it alone. Kind of like a child plays with a toy and then one day puts it away never to be played with again. They believe God just created the world and now just put it to one side, put it in a box. They conclude that, God's voice can't be heard. And given the absence of God's voice, creation, we're free to listen to whatever voice we deem best. But the thing is, our God is not silent. Our God, the God spoken about in the book of Hebrews, is not like this at all, and what good news it is. Many think that God is mute, that he is silent, but he's not mute. He's not silent. He didn't just create us and then push us to one side, forget about us. No, he cares. He is interested in his creation, and he is interested in us. And Hebrews 1 says that he has spoken. God has spoken. Look at verse 1, which says that he has spoken to our forefathers, our ancestors. And by this, he means that God has spoken in the past to the ancestors of those receiving this letter, which was Christian Jews who had become Christians. This was the ancestors, the forefathers were the Jewish people, God's people. And you see, throughout the Old Testament, we see that God, time and time again, did speak to his people. He wasn't silent. Verse 1, he did it through prophets, and he did this at many times and in a variety of ways. He would raise up prophets who would speak his very words to reveal something of who he is and to show his people how they were to live. God isn't silent. He wasn't silent in the past, and as we'll see in verse 2, he isn't silent now either. And I think human speech is really interesting. I think it's inherently relational. When I speak to you, it is a relational thing. And it's the same with God's speech. God's speech is inherently relational. You see, the very fact that he has spoken shows us that he wants to be heard, to be known. He is a relational God who has spoken in order to show us something of who he is, so that we can know him. And not just know about him, no random facts about him. No, he has spoken that we might know him genuinely and personally. Now, if you could receive a phone call from anyone in the world, just thought experiment, who would it be? Have a second to think. Who would it be if you could receive a phone call from anyone in the world? Would it be your favourite sportsman, the king, favourite author, actor, singer? Well, now imagine this evening you get a call from an unknown number. Now you choose to answer it, and it turns out to be that very person. They've taken time out of their very busy schedule, and they've chosen to pursue a relationship with you. They picked up the phone, they've dialed your number, and now they're speaking to you. Well, even more amazing than that person speaking to you, seeking relationship with you, your Creator God seeking relationship with you has spoken to you. He's spoken to us. So how has God spoken? Well, I think many people want to hear God's voice. Many do. And many people seek to hear from God in all sorts of ways. I mean, in the UK, it's becoming more and more secular, and yet we still live in a very religious world. Many people want to hear from God. Some think that how they will hear from God is by going to a spiritual guru. Or some maybe think that God is trying to communicate to them through some different events in their life that they need to work out what God is saying. Some search the scriptures looking for some hidden message that needs decoding. But we don't have to guess how God has spoken. We don't have to find a way. No, verse 2 tells us how God has spoken. He's spoken by his Son. Now, if I told you that I would send you an email, you wouldn't wait by the phone all day. You wouldn't expect a letter to arrive in the post. You wouldn't be sat there waiting for this letter to arrive. No, you'd check your email inbox, because that's how I told you I was going to communicate with you. Well, verse 2 tells us the method of God's communication with us. In these last days, that's now, he has spoken to us by his Son. And look at how the first few verses of chapter 1 describe this Son by whom God has spoken. The Son is described as the heir of all things. Now, I don't know if you stand to inherit much in your life, or have inherited something in your life. I mean, all that I've inherited throughout my life so far is a spoon collection from my grandfather. It was to be shared between me and my older brother, and we fought long and hard over who would get this spoon collection. And in the end, my brother got it, the whole collection, so I haven't inherited anything. But there are people out there who stand to inherit far more than a spoon collection. I have a friend from uni who, at the age of, I think, 23, inherited a whole house from a distant aunt that she didn't really know. She stood to inherit quite a lot. But there's people who stand to inherit even more, say the prince of a nation. Like, they stand to inherit vast wealth, power, authority. But the Son, by whom God has spoken, well, he stands to inherit far, far more. In fact, he is the heir of all things, and therefore his inheritance includes all things, the whole of creation. It includes the tallest mountains, the deepest oceans, the vast sky. His inheritance even includes the smallest atom on the most distant planet. God the Father has appointed the Son heir of all things. This Son whom God has spoken by is incredible, but he's not just the heir of all things. He's also the creator of all things. All that is in existence, all that ever has been in existence, and all that will ever be in existence, well, that was made through the Son. The whole universe and all in it was made through him. But Hebrews 1 doesn't stop there. Jesus the Son, he's not just the heir, he's not just heir and creator, he's also the sustainer of all things. Have you ever wondered why the sun rises in the morning and why it sets in the evening? Now, there is a scientific reason, but actually here in verse 3 we see a theological reason. Why does the sun rise in the morning and set in the evening? Well, because the sun, S-O-N, is sustaining all things. He tells the sun in the sky to get up in the morning, tells it to take a little nap in the evening. He's sustaining all things. Have you ever wondered maybe what keeps the laws of nature constant? Have you ever wondered why gravity doesn't just randomly change its strength? That would be weird, wouldn't it? Or maybe change its direction of pull. Why? Why does it not? Well, because the sun is sustaining all things in existence by his powerful word. Incredible, isn't it? What an incredible description Hebrews gives of Jesus the Son. In fact, he's described in such lofty terms that I think we're left to make only one conclusion. The Son is God himself. In verse 3 we see this, that he is God himself, and yet the Son is distinct from the Father. He is the Son. Look at verse 3. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being. In the same way that the sun in the sky gives off light, Well, God the Father emits his gloriously radiant light, his sun. Now, if the sun in the sky didn't emit light, well, we'd be in darkness, unable to see. Even the sun in the sky would be hidden in darkness. See, God's glorious sun, the very radiance of God's glory, shines from God the Father. And without the glorious light, the radiant sun shining forth from God the Father, well, we would be in darkness, unable to see the Father. In fact, actually, it's by the radiant sun shining from God the Father that the Father has spoken to us and revealed himself to us. You see, the Son in himself, the exact representation of God's being, having eternally existed and enjoyed relationship with his Father, he, the Son, is the way God has spoken to us. How is God's voice heard? Well, it's heard by anyone who looks to Jesus, the Son, the exact representation of God's being. Now, I don't know if you're like me, but sometimes I might question how reliable our knowledge of God is. I know many people do. We sometimes wish that God would just make himself a bit clearer. Would you just speak a bit clearer? I want to hear your voice. But the truth is, we couldn't ask for a more accurate, more clear revelation of who God is than what we see in Jesus the Son. God's nature, his character, his attitude towards you, it's not hidden. He's told us. We don't have to try and work out what God is like. We need to pay attention to what he's said by his Son. Question we might go, is God good? Well, look at his Son. Pay close attention to how he lived on the earth. He lived the perfect life. He walked in the ways of righteousness. Look at how he interacted with the most vulnerable, the most downtrodden in society. Look at his understanding of justice. Is God good? Look at the Son. Well, is God all-powerful? Again, look at the Son. Pay close attention to his authority over all creation, over demons, over disease, over death. Yeah, he is. Or maybe you might ask the question, well, what's God's attitude towards me? A broken sinner, drenched in unrighteousness. Again, we don't have to guess what God's attitude to us is like. We can pay close attention to what he has said by his Son. You see, Jesus, he wasn't ashamed to sit with the sinner, to break bread, to share a meal with the sinner. In fact, he said he came not for the righteous, for the person who thinks they've got it all sorted out, but no, he came for you, the sinner, for the person who recognizes their needs and comes to him. If you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus, the exact representation of his being. Jesus himself even said that this was the case. He said that if you had seen him, you had seen the Father. How incredible. If you've seen Jesus, you've seen the Father. You know what God is like. So if we want to hear God's voice, if we want to hear what he has said, we're to look to his Son. For he has spoken in these last days by his Son. But what has God spoken by his Son? I mean, we talked about how he's really revealed who he is, his nature, but I think there's more. I think he also speaks of the salvation that he achieved through his Son. He has spoken salvation by his Son. In the past, God spoke through his prophets, talked about earlier. He spoke through those prophets to reveal something of God's salvation for humanity. You see, through the prophets, we see what the problem is. You see, mankind, me, you, we're in need of cleansing. In fact, kind of like polluted stream water, we're in need of purifying. You see, our God is a clean, pure, perfect God. And in order to come to him and enjoy the relationship with him that we were made for, well, we need to be cleansed. We need to be purified. But the prophets did note a problem. See, according to the prophets, this cleansing that we need, it's not just some ceremonial surface-level cleansing that we could do ourselves. See, a bubble bath won't do it. We need a deep cleansing of our very hearts. And this is something that we're incapable of doing ourselves. And yet, the prophets trusted that God had a solution. He had a plan that he would provide a way for them to be cleansed. And they pointed forward to that day, the day that God would cleanse and purify his people. What a day that would be. Well, the prophets, they were kind of like these signposts pointing beyond themselves to the salvation to come. They're not trying to draw attention to themselves. No, they were pointing away, further ahead to something even greater that was coming. They were ultimately pointing to God's salvation master plan. And in verse 2, we see that plan. It's this, it's in these last days, he has spoken by his Son. It's his Son. That's the master plan for salvation, for purification. It is his Son. The prophets were signposts to the coming of God's Son, to the heir, the creator, the sustainer, who would come and be purifier. How was man going to be cleansed and purified? How was God going to do it? By his Son. You see, his Son provided purification for sins by his own blood. God spoke salvation, purification by his Son. See, Jesus, his Son, came into the world. He cleansed the uncleansable. He purified the unpurifiable. He came and on the cross provided purification for all who trust in him. Amazing, isn't it? The Son on the cross purified all who have, all who do, and all who will trust in him. And now he is seated next to the Father in heaven, having completed his purification work. It's incredible, isn't it? So given that God has spoken, that he's spoken by his Son, that he's spoken salvation by his Son, well, how are we to respond to all this? I mean, if you were to read the whole letter of Hebrews, which I'd encourage you to do, well worth doing, you'd see that actually many Jewish Christians, the original audience of this letter, they were facing, increasing pressure to abandon Christ the Son and to return, to go back to their old Jewish ways of life. Many were publicly insulted and persecuted for their faith in Jesus the Son. Some, they were put in prison for their faith. Others had property confiscated for their trust in Jesus the Son. And you can imagine all the voices that they might hear, offering different opinions about how they should respond to this increasing pressure. There would be the voices telling them just to give up on Christ, saying, you didn't face all of this when you followed your old Jewish ways. Is Jesus really worth losing your house, your livelihood? Christ hasn't brought you peace, he's only brought you chaos, and if you continue to stand with him, he's going to surely bring you to death. The Son has abandoned you, so abandon him. So there might be those voices, but there might also be some other voices that the Hebrews might hear, the voices of the pragmatists. You don't really have to totally abandon Jesus the Son, just maybe don't focus on him so much. Maybe if the focus of your faith wasn't on Jesus, but was on the Jewish religion, then you'd be fine. The ceremony, that will help. Yeah, then you'll be fine. Well, believe whatever you want about Jesus, but just keep it to yourself. See, there are many voices that the Hebrews could have listened to, and I think we might hear many of those same voices today. We might hear those voices telling us to abandon the Son, just outright deny him and walk away. But we might also hear the voice of the pragmatists telling us to maybe demote him, to not quite listen to his voice so much. But Hebrews warns and tells us and calls us not to do that. It calls us to listen to him, to listen to the Son, not to abandon him. And this is really why I got the reading to go all the way up to chapter 2, verse 4. Obviously, did it because Hebrews 1's an amazing chapter, but also all the way to Hebrews 2, verses 1 to 4, because Hebrews 2, verses 1 to 4 really shows us how we're to respond to all that's said in chapter 1. How are we to respond to the Son, whom God has spoken by? Well, chapter 2, verse 1 says that we must pay careful attention to what God has said by his Son. Actually, we must pay the most careful attention. You see, there will be many voices fighting to be heard and listened to. But we're to be careful to listen to what God has spoken. We're to listen to him. We're to make sure that the most influential voice in our life is his. Don't abandon the Son. Don't de-emphasize him. Don't allow other voices to drown his out. Don't take your attention off what God has spoken by his Son. Don't even do it for a second. For God has spoken salvation by his Son. And chapter 2, 1 to 4 really makes clear the danger. It's a real warning, actually, of what will happen if we do ignore him. If we don't pay the most careful attention, what will happen? Well, before we know it, we will find ourselves having drifted away. And if you've drifted too far away from the Son and the purification of sins that he purchased with his own blood, you'll find yourself drenched in your own sin and without any means of cleansing. God has spoken, and ignoring Jesus, his Son, the one he has spoken by, well, it is a big and costly mistake. It's a very strong warning, isn't it? The point is that we're therefore to listen to him, listen to his voice, make sure we listen to his voice. So let's listen to Jesus, the Son, by whom God has spoken. Why don't I pray for us as we finish, and we might do exactly that.